On January 30, 1945, one of the worst maritime disasters in history unfolded in the frigid waters of the Baltic Sea. The MV Wilhelm Gustloff, a former luxury cruise liner, was packed with over 10,000 desperate souls fleeing the advancing Soviet Red Army. They believed they were sailing to safety. They were wrong. What happened next would kill over 9,000 people, more than 6 times the death toll of the Titanic. And for decades, the true story of the Wilhelm Gustloff remained hidden, a forgotten tragedy in the final, chaotic months of World War II. This is the story of the deadliest disaster at sea. The Wilhelm Gustloff was born not for war, but for pleasure. Launched in 1937, she was the crown jewel of the Nazis' Strength Through Joy program, a massive cruise ship designed to reward loyal German workers with luxury vacations. With a length of over 200 meters and a capacity for 1,500 passengers, she was a floating paradise, complete with a swimming pool, gymnasium, and multiple dining halls. The ship was named for Wilhelm Gustloff, the leader of the Nazi Party in Switzerland, who had been assassinated in 1936. Adolf Hitler himself made the decision, turning the ship into a potent symbol of the Third Reich. The Gustloff was the first purpose-built cruise ship for the German labor front, and she represented everything the Nazi regime wanted to project: power, luxury, and control. But the Gustloff's life as a cruise ship was short-lived. When war broke out in 1939, she was painted white and repurposed as a hospital ship, ferrying wounded soldiers from the front lines. For over a year, she served in this capacity, her elegant cabins now filled with the broken bodies of men torn apart by war. By 1940, her role changed again. Painted a dull naval gray, she became a floating barracks, a home for over 1,000 U-boat trainees in the occupied Polish port of Gotenhafen. For 4 long years, she sat in the harbor, a silent witness to the unfolding war. The ship that once carried carefree vacationers now housed young men training to wage underwater warfare. The Gustloff had become a symbol not of joy, but of war itself. By January 1945, the tide of war had turned. The Soviet Red Army was relentlessly pushing west, closing in on East Prussia. Millions of German civilians were trapped, caught between the advancing Soviets and the sea. Stories of Soviet brutality, tales of rape, murder, and revenge spread through the population like wildfire. The fear was palpable. The only escape was westward, toward the coast. A mass exodus began. In the bitter cold of winter, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children fled their homes, desperate to reach the coast. Their only hope was Operation Hannibal, a massive maritime evacuation to ferry them to safety. This was the largest maritime evacuation in history, a desperate gamble to save German civilians from the advancing Soviet forces. The port of Gotenhafen was a scene of chaos and desperation. Over 100,000 refugees flooded the city, all vying for a place on one of the evacuation ships. The Wilhelm Gustloff, once a symbol of joy, was now their last hope. Families stood in the freezing cold, clutching whatever possessions they could carry, waiting for a chance to board. Official records show 6,050 people boarded the Gustloff, but in the chaos, thousands more scrambled aboard without tickets. The true number, painstakingly researched by survivor Heinz Schoen, was over 10,500. The ship, designed for 1,500, was now a floating city of the desperate. Nearly half of them were children. There were mothers with infants, elderly grandparents, and teenagers barely old enough to remember peacetime. They were packed into every available space: the cabins, the corridors, the dining halls, even the drained swimming pool. At midday on January 30th, 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff finally set sail. The air was thick with snow, the sea dotted with ice floes. The ship was dangerously overcrowded and had only a single torpedo boat, the Lowe, as an escort. Originally, 2 torpedo boats were supposed to accompany the Gustloff, but one suffered mechanical problems and had to turn back. The massive ship, carrying over 10,000 people, was left with minimal protection in waters known to be infested with Soviet submarines. On the bridge, a fatal argument was brewing. The ship had 4 captains on board: the Gustloff's captain, 2 merchant marine captains, and the captain of the U-boat complement. They couldn't agree on the safest route. The experienced U-boat commander, Lieutenant Commander Wilhelm Gustloff, argued passionately for a course through the shallow coastal waters where submarines would have difficulty operating. He also insisted that the ship travel in darkness, with all lights extinguished. But Captain Friedrich Petersen, the Gustloff's commanding officer, overruled him. Petersen chose the deep, open sea, a route that would take the ship through waters known to be patrolled by Soviet submarines. His reasoning was that the deeper waters offered more room to maneuver if they encountered enemy vessels. It was a decision that would seal the fate of thousands. Later that night, another fateful decision was made. Fearing a collision with a German minesweeper convoy in the darkness, Petersen ordered the ship's navigation lights to be turned on. The Wilhelm Gustloff, a massive, slow-moving vessel, was now a brightly lit target in the dark, icy waters of the Baltic. She was a beacon, announcing her presence to anyone watching. And someone was watching. In the depths below, the Soviet submarine S-13, under the command of Alexander Marinesko, had the Gustloff in its sights. Marinesko was a commander in disgrace. Before this mission, he had been facing a court-martial for his drinking and for being caught in a brothel while off duty. The Soviet government had deemed him not suitable to be a hero. He was desperate for a victory, a mission that would restore his reputation and save his career. For 2 hours, Marinesko shadowed the Gustloff, following her through the dark waters. He maneuvered his submarine to the port side of the ship, closer to shore where the attack would be less expected. At 9:16 p.m., Marinesko gave the order. 4 torpedoes, each inscribed with a patriotic slogan conveying the Soviets' desire for revenge, were launched at the Gustloff. 3 of them found their mark. The first torpedo slammed into the bow of the ship. The impact was catastrophic. Watertight doors automatically sealed, trapping the off-duty crew in their quarters below deck. These men, sleeping peacefully just moments before, were now entombed in their bunks, with no way to escape. They would drown in the darkness, never knowing what hit them. The second torpedo struck the drained swimming pool, where 373 female naval auxiliaries were housed in cramped quarters. The explosion was violent and terrible. The ceramic tiles that lined the pool were torn loose and became deadly projectiles, flying through the air at lethal speeds. Women were torn apart by the shrapnel. The screams were deafening. Of the 373 women in that compartment, only 3 survived. The third torpedo was a direct hit on the engine room, located deep in the belly of the ship. The explosion killed the power and plunged the entire vessel into darkness. The engines went silent, the lights flickered and died. The ship was now dead in the water, a helpless giant in the freezing sea. The impact of the 3 explosions sent shockwaves through the entire ship. Passengers who were sleeping were jolted awake. Those who were awake were thrown to the ground. The panic spread like wildfire through the corridors and decks. A stampede for the lifeboats began. Thousands of people, desperate to escape the sinking ship, rushed toward the boat decks. Parents clutched their children. The elderly struggled to keep up. People pushed and shoved, trampling over one another in their desperation to survive. The chaos was absolute. But most of the lifeboats were frozen to their davits, the mechanical devices that held them in place. The extreme cold had made the metal brittle and the ropes stiff. Only 9 of the 22 lifeboats could be launched. The rest were stuck, useless. As the ship listed heavily to port, tilting toward the left, the lifeboats on the starboard side, the right side of the ship, became inaccessible. Those boats that had been lowered on the high starboard side crashed into the hull of the tilting ship, spilling their occupants into the freezing sea. Hundreds of people, already in the lifeboats and thinking they were safe, were suddenly thrown into the water. The water temperature was just 4 degrees Celsius, 39 degrees Fahrenheit. The air temperature was a bone-chilling -18 degrees Celsius, -4 degrees Fahrenheit.
For the thousands who jumped or fell into the sea, death from hypothermia would be swift. Most people in that cold water lose consciousness within minutes. Death follows shortly after.
The ship was tilting faster now, her bow sinking deeper into the water. People on the deck were sliding toward the edge, unable to stop themselves. Some grabbed onto railings and ropes, desperately trying to hold on. Others simply gave up, accepting their fate. Children cried out for their mothers. Mothers screamed for their children. The sounds of human suffering filled the night. In less than an hour, the Wilhelm Gustloff was gone. She slipped beneath the waves, taking with her the hopes and lives of thousands. The great ship that had once carried carefree vacationers, that had housed wounded soldiers and U-boat trainees, was now a tomb. She sank in 44 meters of water, about 30 kilometers offshore, between the Polish towns of Leba and Władysław. German naval vessels rushed to the scene, alerted by the Gustloff's distress signals. The T-36 arrived first, pulling survivors from the icy water. The crew worked frantically, hauling people aboard, wrapping them in blankets, trying to warm them. The T-36 rescued 564 people. The Love, the Gustloff's own escort, saved 472 more. Other vessels arrived, minesweepers, a steamer, even a patrol boat. In total, only 1,252 people were saved, but the rescue efforts were hampered by the very same submarine that had sunk the Gustloff. The S-13 was still in the area, still a threat. The rescue ships had to be careful, had to watch for more torpedoes. Some captains had to make the agonizing decision to leave survivors in the water, to stop picking people up because their ships were full and they couldn't risk losing more lives. One of the last survivors found was a baby, wrapped tightly in a blanket and floating in a lifeboat, surrounded by the dead. The infant was the only survivor in that boat. An officer pulled the baby from the water and took him home. He adopted the boy and raised him as his own son. That child, saved from the frozen sea, would grow up to tell the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff. Over 9,300 people perished in the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff. It remains the single deadliest maritime disaster in history. A tragedy 6 times worse than the Titanic, more deaths than the Lusitania and the Titanic combined. And yet, most people have never heard of it. So why has this story been largely forgotten? The answer is complicated. In the final chaotic months of World War II, the sinking of a German refugee ship was just another tragedy among many. The war was coming to an end. The Allies were advancing on all fronts. The death tolls were staggering. Millions of people were dying. In that context, even 9,000 deaths could be overlooked. The victorious Allies had little sympathy for the suffering of the German people. After years of total war, after learning about the Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities, many in the West felt that Germans deserved whatever suffering came their way. The Wilhelm Gustloff was a German ship carrying German refugees and German soldiers. Why should the Allies care? And for decades after the war, Germany itself was reluctant to confront its own victimhood. There was a stigma about discussing German suffering during the war. To do so seemed to diminish the suffering of those who had been victims of Nazi aggression. It seemed to suggest a kind of moral equivalence between the perpetrators and the victims of the war. So, the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff was buried, hidden away in archives and survivor memoirs. It wasn't until the 21st century, with the publication of Günter Grass's novel Crab Walk in 2002, that the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff finally entered the public consciousness. Grass, a Nobel Prize-winning author, brought the tragedy to life through fiction, introducing millions of readers to the story of the ship and its doomed passengers. Other books followed. Documentaries were made. Slowly, the Wilhelm Gustloff began to emerge from obscurity. But even today, most people have never heard of it. Ask someone about the Titanic, and they'll know the story. Ask them about the Wilhelm Gustloff, and you'll likely get a blank stare. It remains one of history's greatest tragedies and one of history's most forgotten. The wreck today. Today, the Wilhelm Gustloff lies in 44 meters of water in the Baltic Sea, about 19 nautical miles offshore. It is a designated war grave, protected by Polish law. Diving, anchoring, and fishing are forbidden within 500 meters of the wreck.
The ship is a silent, haunting memorial to the thousands who lost their lives on that terrible night. The wreck has attracted the attention of treasure hunters and historians over the years. Some have searched for the legendary Amber Room, a priceless artifact that was supposedly hidden on the ship. But the Polish government has kept the wreck protected, preserving it as a memorial to the dead. A bell salvaged from the wreck was once used as decoration in a Polish seafood restaurant. In 2006, it was lent to an exhibition in Berlin called Forced Paths, where it served as a tangible reminder of the disaster. The Wilhelm Gustloff remains one of the largest shipwrecks on the Baltic Sea floor. She is a reminder of the human cost of war and of a story that for too long remained untold. She is a memorial to the 9,000 souls who perished in her sinking and to the thousands more who died in Operation Hannibal. She is a testament to the resilience of those who survived and to the importance of remembering history, even when that history is difficult and uncomfortable. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff was not a war crime, though some have argued otherwise. It was a tragedy of war, a terrible consequence of the conflict that engulfed Europe. But it was a tragedy that deserves to be remembered, that deserves to be told. Because in remembering the Wilhelm Gustloff, we honor the memory of those who perished, and we remind ourselves of the true cost of war. Thanks for watching. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing for more explorations into forgotten history. The Wilhelm Gustloff story is just one of many untold tales from history. There are countless others waiting to be discovered. Subscribe now and join me as we uncover the stories that history forgot.